My fellow Americans and students in U.S. since 1865, this video deals with the end of the domestic impact of World War II, the Cold War, and the Red Scare. On the domestic impact of World War II, I'm just going to say something very briefly. As I kind of posed the question in an earlier lecture or video or whatever, many people thought if it was the war that got us out of the Depression, then wouldn't we go right back to Depression when the war ended? But that did not happen. Now, there are several factors why, several reasons why, but the main one is simply pent-up consumer demand. During the Depression, people didn't have any money, very much anyway. They did not buy major things like new appliances, homes, or cars. Then the war came, farm prices went up, people got jobs in war industries or just in general industries, and they were making money. But you couldn't buy a car, or you couldn't build a new house. You couldn't buy many appliances because of rationing. So many things like steel and other metals were going into the war effort. Factories had been turned to making airplanes, tanks, and trucks for the military rather than automobiles. So this led to a situation that economists sometimes call forced savings. Now, obviously, the government can hardly force you to save, but it can limit your ability to spend. And so many people during the war years were socking away money. They couldn't spend it as widely as they wanted to. So when the war ended, people had money and they went on a buying binge. And this kept the economy from going back into depression. Now, as to the beginnings of the Cold War, the beginnings of the Cold War go back to events that happened during the war. I mentioned in the material on World War II that the later the second front was opened. The second front was when the United States and Great Britain and nations allied with them launched the invasion into France in June of 1944. The later that came, the farther to the west the Soviets would have advanced through Eastern Europe. So this means when the war ends, the Soviet Union is occupying much of Eastern Europe. Now, at the Yalta Conference in early February 1945, they tried to discuss some of these issues. This was after the after about less than a year after D-Day. At the Yalta Conference, one of the big issues was the Polish question. The Soviet Union said that we should go back to borders as they were in 1939. Well, in 1939, when Hitler had attacked Poland from the west, the Soviets had attacked Poland from the east. And so going back to 1939 boundaries would leave the Soviet Union in control of Poland when it had not been before the war started. Now, at Poland, the Big Three, and the Big Three is a term used to refer to the leaders of the Allied powers, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. And of course, at the very end of the war, after April 1945, Harry Truman would be the president of the United States. in this picture, note that Roosevelt does not look good. This is February 1945, and he would die in early April 1945. But as to the Polish question, they said that Poland would have freely elected but pro-Soviet governments. Now stop and think about that for a minute. If the governments are truly freely elected, how are you going to guarantee they will be pro-Soviet? But this was just left. No one wanted to talk about the fact that there was no way to really make that work. This map shows you the Soviet domination of much of Eastern Europe. These nations technically remained independent, but they were very clearly under the thumb of the Soviet Union. Now, in Truman's administration, Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, that the United States would help nations who were being attacked by armed aggression. This was an attempt to contain communism, not to try to roll back communism where it had already been established in these Eastern European countries, but to keep the Soviets from expanding communist influence even farther. Now, as a part of this, you see eventually the creation of two alliances. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949, an alliance of the Western Allies, and then the Warsaw Pact, founded the following year, I believe, which was the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. Now, in March 1946, Winston Churchill came to the United States, and at Westminster College, a small church-related Presbyterian college in Fulton, Missouri, he made a speech that came to be known as the Iron Curtain speech, saying that an Iron Curtain had descended on Europe, meaning that behind that Iron Curtain in the Soviet-dominated areas, there was oppression, and west of that Iron Curtain, there was freedom. Now, it's interesting, this has become to be known as a classic speech, but at the time, many people roundly criticized Churchill. They said, "You've insulted our ally, the Soviet Union." But events proved it to be a very prophetic statement. This is the line that might be described as the Iron Curtain from Stettin, city not shown on this map, but up on the Baltic coast of Germany. From Stettin to Trieste in the Adriatic Sea, an Iron Curtain has descended on the continent of Europe, Churchill said. Now, in America, you have a renewed Red Scare. People are afraid of communism. There had been a brief Red Scare in the 20s when the Soviets took over in Russia and created the Soviet Union. And there was some reason for fear. Soviet actions in Eastern Europe were seen as aggressive. The Soviet achievement of the nuclear bomb within a relatively short time scared many people. It was assumed that the Soviets must have had help from spies who stole our ideas. Now, scholars today generally think maybe some of the information that was given to the Soviets by spies might have sped up their development a little bit, but not all that much. The Soviet Union had a lot of scientific knowledge and would have had the bomb fairly soon, even if there had been no spying. Klaus Fuchs was a German scientist who worked at the Los Alamos nuclear facility, or actually, I don't believe he worked there, but he ran an agent who worked there and passed nuclear information to the Soviets. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted of espionage for stealing atomic secrets from this same lab. They were both convicted and sentenced to death. Scholars today generally believe that Ethel Rosenberg may have been guilty of doing nothing more than not informing on her husband. But they sought the death penalty against her, thinking that in order to save her, Julius might decide to confess and tell what he had done, but he never did. They both were executed in 1953. Another thing that scared people about the spread of communism was the communist victory in 1949, when Mao Zedong's communist Red Army won the revolution in China. George C. Marshall was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army during World War II, and then he was briefly Secretary of State under Truman. He supported a negotiated settlement in China between the communist and non-communist forces. This was enough to make many people think that he was a great traitor, when actually most scholars would say he was probably a great hero. Now, the trial of Alger Hiss is another thing that shows that there was some cause for fear. Alger Hiss was a man who had worked in many agencies in the government during the New Deal era, including in the State Department. In the 1940s, the House Un-American Activities Committee was investigating charges of communist spies in the government. And a man named Whittaker Chambers, who worked at Time magazine, said that in the 1930s, he himself had been a communist, and that Alger Hiss had passed him documents to pass on to Soviet authorities. Now, to understand all of this, you have to understand that Alger Hiss was a man who had gone to all the right schools. He knew all the right people. Many Americans just could not believe that this man could be a traitor. President Truman publicly endorsed him when he was brought before the committee. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote letters praising him. Dean Acheson, the acting Secretary of State at the time, praised him. So many people found it hard to believe this Harvard-educated man had betrayed the United States. Now, Richard Nixon was a freshman congressman, meaning this is his first term in Congress. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were both elected to the House in the same year, 1946. Nixon was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which often went by its initials, HUAC. And when Chambers charged that Hiss had been a spy, Hiss said that he had the right to come to the committee and present a defense. And this was a mistake on his part, because eventually he is convicted of perjury for lying to the committee. He could not be tried for the espionage because of the statute of limitations, but he was tried for perjury and convicted and spent a little less than 3 years in prison, I believe. Now, the Hiss case was significant because it brings Richard Nixon to the forefront. He moved from the House to the Senate to win a seat in the Senate, and then in 1952 he was chosen by President Eisenhower to be his vice presidential candidate. Now, I did want to kind of finish up on Hiss. After the Soviet Union fell and scholars got access to some of the archives, the evidence is pretty clear that Alger Hiss was involved in spying, but there are still people who defend him, that he was a victim of a witch hunt. One scholar said, I found out that Alger Hiss is like a religion with some people, and you just can't discuss religion with some people. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the hero of World War II, emerged as the Republican candidate in 1952. The previous slide, I had a picture of Senator Robert Taft. Taft was kind of the champion of the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and many people thought he was going to be the Republican nominee in 1952. When Eisenhower got the nomination, he appointed Nixon because he knew that Eisenhower's nomination had upset some of the conservatives who wanted Taft. And so in order to try to placate those conservatives, he picked Richard Nixon as his running mate. This is a picture of Ike and Dick on the 1952 ticket. And they were elected, of course, in 52 and reelected in 1956. Now, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Joseph McCarthy was elected to the Senate in 1946, the same year that Nixon and Kennedy went into the House. McCarthy is elected to the Senate. Now, in 1952, he's up for re-election. He had not done much in his first term, and he was looking for an issue to try to gain popularity in his re-election campaign. And he decided to go after the issue of communists in the government. Now, as we've already talked about, with these charges like Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, Alger Hiss, there was some concern. But McCarthy went after people who there was no real evidence about. Most of the people that he claimed were communists were people who, back in the 30s, when the economy was going very badly, they had kind of dabbled in some interest in communism and never had really become a part of the movement. And he ruined many lives and many careers with his wild, baseless charges. Now, he had been elected as a county prosecutor in Wisconsin before World War II. After Pearl Harbor, he immediately enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He knew that if you want a career in politics after the war, you need to serve. He gave himself the nickname Tail Gunner Joe, although he did not fly in combat. He was in the Marine Aviation Wing in a combat zone in the Pacific, but his job was a desk job as an intelligence officer, where he debriefed pilots after their mission. This is a picture of him in a Marine aircraft laying claim to this title as Tail Gunner Joe. Now, you know, I'm not saying he never went up in a plane in combat. He may have, but that was not his main job. Now, in 1946, he was elected to the Senate. In 1954, McCarthy started an investigation of the Army that became known as the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy was the chairman of a committee in the Senate on investigations, and he had basically authority to investigate about anything he wanted. For a long time, McCarthy seemed to just have considerable power. Politicians and reporters both seemed to be afraid to attack him, because then he would start to say, well, you must be a communist. You know, if you don't want me going after communists in government, maybe you're a little pink. Now, Eisenhower eventually decided to go after McCarthy, but he used Nixon to do it. Eisenhower wanted to appear to be a statesman who was above the rough and tumble of American politics, and so he used Nixon to go after McCarthy. Nixon had very solid anti-communist credentials, and nobody would believe it if McCarthy tried to say that Nixon was pink. Now, I commented in the notes that I posted about the Cold War and the Red Scare. Edward R. Murrow, a great journalist of this time, he had a popular TV show, and he brought McCarthy on, and as we would say today, he got in his face. He was the first reporter to really take the chance of confronting McCarthy. And as I noted in the notes, this was the day before I was born. Many people liked what McCarthy said. They thought there was a real case that there were communists in government. But you have to remember, TV was not as prominent as it is today. On the Murrow show and then in the Army McCarthy hearings, which were broadcast daily, gavel to gavel on the major networks in the United States, people started to see McCarthy in action and found out that he reminded them of the kid who stole your lunch money on the playground in grade school, a bully who just always was demanding his way. Now, at the Army McCarthy hearings, a man named Joseph Welch, who is the man on the right here with his hand on his forehead, Welch was a lawyer hired by the Army, a private lawyer hired by the Army to present their case at these hearings. And Welch is often credited with kind of finally breaking the spell of McCarthyism. McCarthy tried to bring up a case of a young man who worked for Welch's law firm. This man, like I mentioned earlier, back in the 30s, some people had been part of movements that the government thought might be kind of pro-communist. These groups were sometimes called fellow travelers or Communist Front organizations. But like many people, this man had kind of looked into those things and then never really got involved. But McCarthy brought him up, and Joseph Welch got in his face. He said, I deliberately didn't bring this man to these hearings because I didn't want this issue to be raised about him. And he finally confronted McCarthy. Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you left no decency? And then he said, this isn't an exact quote, but he said, I hope God can forgive you because I cannot. This seemed like the Wicked Witch was dead, you know. The McCarthy just sat there. You can find this, just Google Army McCarthy hearings, and you can find plenty of videos of this. He sat there with a look on his face like, what did I do? What's gone wrong? And the spell just seemed to be broken, and McCarthy never had the kind of influence after this. Journalists and cameramen set down their notepads and their cameras and applauded after Welch took on McCarthy. A few months later, the U.S. Senate censured McCarthy, which doesn't carry any punishment. You just have to go stand in front of the Senate while they formally say, naughty, naughty, shame on you. McCarthy, he would have been up for re-election in 1958, but he died in 1957 of complications of alcoholism. Some of his friends believed that he deliberately drank himself to death. Now, you can look at some of the material here on some of these slides on your own. The last thing I wanted to talk about, in terms of the kinds of evidence that could be used in a court of law, McCarthy never discovered a single communist in the U.S. government. Some people resigned from jobs rather than face the trouble he had created for them. But he did not have the evidence that would have ever convicted anyone. He actually damaged the anti-communist cause. He cried wolf when there wasn't a wolf, but there were spies, and yet he made the whole idea of communist infiltration of the government seem to be ridiculous. So he damaged the very cause that he was trying to promote. Well, as Edward R. Murrow ended his broadcasts, good night and good luck.